All right. So, first of all, how many of you here are maintaining SDKs for your companies? Wow, nice. Very good. You don't count. How many are managing more than 3 languages? Oh, wow, okay. How about 4? Okay. 5? 6? Woo! Can I get a 7? Oh, you are my people. You guys. So yeah, that's cool. Okay, cool. So maybe what I'm going to say might be relevant to you guys. All right. So who is this guy? Why are you listening to me? I can't answer that question, but I could tell you who I am. So I started off as a classical developer, trained in computer science, and then went to the dark side, did some electrical engineering, but mostly it was software stuff. And then I somehow thought I could start businesses. Failed at that a whole bunch of times. And then one of my partners decided to start this crazy idea called SendGrid, and joined that as a product manager and did some QA. And then fast forward, I got into DevRel, and when I was in the DevRel team, managing the SDKs was sort of our side part-time job in between flying around the world. And so nobody really owned it. We all just kind of took turns at it. It wasn't really a thing. But then, after traveling more than 2 years, that became stressful, so it was time to look at what to do next. And so next became something called Hacker in Residence, which was just a way to kind of be there and figure out what's next. And so next became Developer Experience Engineer. And so our first goal is to tame our libraries. And, just a summary of all that. This is who I really am. I am a card-carrying member of the Septilingual Maintainerati. Basically, that's pretty obvious, so I'll just skip that. So these are the main languages that we support at SendGrid. Those are all your favorite languages, maybe some of your not-so-favorite languages. And no matter what I think about the particular language, I must give it all of my tender, loving care. And that's not difficult. So the thing is, these libraries send a lot of emails, and there's a lot of people that rely on these things. And when we first ended up inheriting these SDKs, the first job was a big API migration. So we went from a version 2 of our API to a version 3, and it was a huge breaking change, but a really positive change. It was a change that took lots and lots of hours of interviewing developers and finding out what they need and figuring out how to recraft our API to fit their needs. But the issue was our previous API, the V2, it only supported our mail sending endpoint, which is arguably the most important one. But now we have over 200 other endpoints that we needed to support. And unfortunately, all the SDKs were tightly coupled to that one endpoint. So our job was to refactor all of the things in a reasonable amount of time to support the V3. So when we actually mapped it out, it turned out it would be about 8 years of work. And I think that was my actual face when I figured that out. It's like, you want me to do what? So obviously, this is not manageable to do by hand. So one of the things that we had to figure out is how much of this can we automate? Could we use existing tools? Should we build tools? There's a whole bunch of questions we had about how are we going to make this reasonable? Obviously, our customers are not going to wait 8 years for us to implement all of this by hand. So we thought about it long and hard, and we came up with a list of things that we should automate versus what we shouldn't automate. And hopefully this list will help you save a whole bunch of time because it's a challenging thing. There's tons of tools. First thing is documentation. So one of the problems, and this was something that Noah talked about yesterday, is you have documentation in multiple places within your company. You may have your official documentation page. You've got documentation in the code. You've got tutorials. You've got blog posts. You've got all sorts of stuff. And how do you keep all that stuff in sync? That's just thinking about it makes me stressed out already again, all over again. And so what we decided to do is standardize. We chose OpenAPI for this at the time, Swagger. And one of the things that we didn't want to do was write these. It takes, that's also a tedious exercise to go through and write all of this stuff. And good luck with convincing your engineers to do that for you. Fortunately, we found this tool called stoplight.io, and if you haven't visited them, they have a booth right out there, and their product is amazing. It saved us tons of time. Can't stress that enough. It's just such a time-saving thing. We were able to graphically create our documentation inside of their tool, and then they spit out the open API spec for us. And that was huge, because now we had this central truth that we could use. And so we set about thinking about how could we use this central specification to start automating things. So we first started automating the docs. So we have this usage file in each one of the repos that explains how to call each one of our endpoints. And we do that automatically generated from this document. So that way, every time the documentation change is there, we can propagate that through all of our different libraries and all the different languages. Be careful when you do that, though, because if you mix snake case with camel case in the wrong language, people will be angry, and they will call you all sorts of names. Just got to get used to it. Integration test, that's another thing that Stoplight offers, is this thing called Prism. What Prism does is you throw it an open API spec, and it actually creates a mock server. It's a beautiful thing, because now I didn't have to write and learn all the different mocking things and all the different languages. I started down that path, and I quickly wanted to poke my eyes out, because each one does it different, and it was just really painful. And then I had to mock like 200 some different calls. That was no good. And so using this, I just pointed the spec to it, and boom, I had this server. And then we ended up making it so that now on Travis, we spin up these Prism servers, and all the integration tests run through that. And now we've created Docker containers, so our contributors can just spin up a Docker, and then they have basically a mocked out SendGrid API for all the endpoints, so that they can test before even having to actually hit our API. It's a beautiful thing. Examples. So one of the things we wanted to make sure is that people can easily cut and paste something that they wanted to do. Like, say, for example, they wanted to get all their stats about their emails. We just wanted them to be able to go in there, grab some code, and then boom, they're ready to go. So to do that across all the 200 endpoints, across all the languages, obviously you don't want to do that by hand. But you do, and I'll talk about this later, you do want to create use case helpers on top of this core automated code, because you want to make it more friendly than just basically HTTP calls. So a lot of the low-level code can be automated in this way. Low-level meaning the actual forming the HTTP calls, those can all be automated. The CLA process. So I used to dread this thing, because whenever we had to get someone to sign a CLA, they had to download a PDF, sign it, email it back to us, and then had to maintain a spreadsheet, and it was really painful. Eventually you get to the point where you have to have a CLA, and so CLA-Assistant.io is a tool that we found that SAP created. It's really another one of those can't live without tools. We love that tool very much. What it does is when someone contributes and they make a PR, it automatically posts something there saying, hey, sign our CLA. They click a button, they fill out a form, they get authenticated with GitHub, and then boom, they're done. It's really beautiful, and our Travis CI will not continue and let them, they will not pass without them signing that CLA. And then it stores all that data in a database in the background so that they don't have to sign the CLA again on that repo. Beautiful thing. Swag, that was another thing. We love giving out swag. Anyone that makes a PR on one of our repos, we swag them out. We give them a beautiful unicorn skin t-shirt supporting here. And then we also give them a sticker. And what we found is that it's been amazing, the power of a shirt and the power of ownership. Just this last month in Hacktoberfest, last year we had 47 pull requests. This year we had over 1,000. The power of the t-shirt is strong. It's amazing. And so we, just as a general policy, whenever someone does a PR, and what's interesting is about 80-something% of our contributors are from all over the world. So for us, it's fantastic. For for that investment, we have people all over the world wearing SendGrid swag. It's pretty cool. Problem is, the way we did this before was they had to email us with their contact information, and again, the dreaded spreadsheet, and then we had to actually send that information over to the swag provider, and it was just so painful, especially now thinking about how many PRs we have this last month. Doing that would be insane. So our swag provider named Kotis, which is an awesome company, Kotis, they provide an API for sending swag. Swag as a service, pretty awesome. So now that stuff is automated. We created a front-end form that people can fill out. Basically, the form is authenticated with GitHub, and if they're authenticated with GitHub and then there's a associated merged PR, then we allow the form to go through, and then we have a final check where we approve it, and then once we approve the swag, it fires off the API, and then boom, they get a t-shirt and a sticker. Pretty nice thing. And then and I mentioned this before with the Stoplight.io's prison, we are able to mock all the API calls to SendGrid. This is important for a variety of reasons, not the least that people don't want to waste their credits testing, but it also allows contributors to contribute to our code and have a full coverage suite without dealing with even having a SendGrid account. Pretty cool. So what won't we automate? The HTTP clients. One of the things that we wanted to do when we decided to refactor our stuff was try to get rid of as many dependencies as possible. In particular, I remember with PHP, we were using Guzzle, and it would seem like every week we'd get some issue about how Guzzle is not compatible with this or some other framework. It was very painful. So what we decided to do is, wherever possible, just use the native HTTP client that comes with the language. Unfortunately, this is not possible with Java because for some reason Java decides that they don't care about supporting patch. And there's a ticket, and they put won't fix. Because they said, you need to wait till Java 9, and then you'll have your proper patch. So we use Apache's HTTP client for that. Now, the downside, of course, is when you don't use one of these nifty third-party HTTP clients, you don't get all of the goodness that's already baked in there. Like sometimes you lose things like being able to have timeouts and things of that nature. But what's cool is once you build the bare bones minimum, the community will tell you what's missing. And if you just pay attention and listen, you'll end up getting the bare minimum of what they need to get their problem solved. And so the helper code, we're calling it helpers, but you can also call it use cases. Basically, the idea is looking at what are the most common things that people do with your service, and how can you create code to make that as fast and easy as possible. And that very difficult to automate, especially across the different languages. But what's cool, once your community starts interacting with you, like what we had with Hacktoberfest, they'll start contributing these things. And so if you set up a system whereby people can easily add helpers to your project, that helps out a lot. So we put some thought into how can we basically create kind of like a plug-in system where people can just add in helpers, and that way the community, as they need stuff, they can contribute helpers. Like in our case, for example, a helper might be adding an attachment to a file. Like maybe you have an attachment that's a huge attachment and you want to store it in Dropbox or Box before you send it. That's a perfect example for a helper. And people in the community are very good with helping with that sort of stuff. Getting started docs. Another thing that we care a lot about is how quickly and fast we can solve a developer's problem. Usually they're under some sort of time pressure, and your thing is just part of their list of 20 other things they need to do. So making that process, getting in your developer's shoes and thinking about they're under pressure, they come to your site, how can you just get them through and solve their problem as fast as possible? That needs to be handcrafted. Same thing with use case docs. So beyond helpers, you should also have solutions for very specific problems. Like say, I want to deploy something to Azure to monitor my incoming emails. How do you do that? We have the SDK that can show you how to write the code, but how do you do that from end to end? How do you solve that entire problem? I think personally, developers, I love it whenever I find someone that has made me a tutorial that goes end to end how to do a thing. That's awesome. But again, that's not something that's automatable, maybe some components of it, but very worthwhile to do. Unit tests as well. For us, we automated the integration test using the Prism stuff. but for the unit test, you probably want to go in there and do those by hand, at least for the core functionality of your API. So a little bit about community. We are SendGrid-led, community-driven, meaning that we're providing some framework, we're providing some guidance, but we really listening to our community because we have people from all over the world with opinions, ideas, needs, and my boss, Matt, he's going to be talking a little bit later about all the time he spends actually talking to the developers and finding out what they need. And we totally take that information and put it into our roadmap to figure out how we can best serve them. But one of the notes I wanted to highlight is that when we initially did that transition from V2 to V3, we put this big notice on all the repos, big bold letters in red, asking for feedback, and we thought the feedback would come pouring in. But actually what happened, it was crickets. Nobody said anything. And so I asked a few people internally and got the thumbs up. I said, okay, well, we're just going to do this. Nobody seems to care. And then once we actually released the stuff, that's when everybody started rabble-rousing and saying, hey, why did you do this? That thing is stupid. Don't do that. And then it was just crazy how people came out the woodworks. Obviously, it's best to get the feedback before all of that. But then now, what we've learned is now whenever we're proposing a major change, we look back at all of our main contributors and we tag them on that issue and get their feedback. And we have some fantastic now, if you look at our repo, we're in the midst of some refactoring. If you just look at some of those threads, you see some amazing conversations back and forth with the community. The biggest example of that was with our C# library. When I was looking at how to uniformly create all of these different libraries, I had two buckets. Like these were dynamic typed libraries, these were static typed, and then in my ignorance I put the C# in the dynamic typed bucket, and then I basically got crucified by the community. But what the great thing that came out of that is, out of all those opinions, I listened very carefully and figured out how to aggregate those to create something that it was truly community created. And now it's something that we can be proud of and that people use, and it works very well. So you may want to know, how do we do all of the things? We're a very small team. I'm the only engineer on this team. We have a product manager who's sitting right over there that has a talk a little bit later, and he's going to explain. So I definitely, if you're wondering how the hell do you manage all this mess of stuff, he's got the secret. He's got the secret sauce. Before his method, I would be super stressed all the time looking at all this avalanche of stuff coming in. But he created some amazing stuff that makes my life a lot less stressful, and I think a lot fairer to our community in terms of who gets their issues solved first and how we decide what we need to do. To give you a little preview, basically we use something called RICE, where it's a formula that helps us determine what should be the next thing that we work on. And he'll go into more detail later about what that is. But basically what we do is basically a Kanban style type of workflow. Before we were using Jira, and everything that came in GitHub was tickets. The problem with that was very hard to look at hundreds, sometimes thousands of tickets and figure out what do we do next. That was the question we could not answer, because we couldn't do a comparison amongst all of our things against each other. But now we can, using Matt's magical method, is what I'm going to call it, trademark. And it works very well. I don't know how I'm doing on time here. Let's see. I think I got a couple minutes left. So I highly recommend, if you want to know some of the nuts and bolts of how we organize this stuff, definitely go to Matt's talk a little bit later today. It'll be awesome. And thank you for showing up here.